Am I bad? For involuntarily causing my coworker's marriage collapse. 2 or 3 years ago, I used to work shifts with a married coworker, Crystal, who had a husband and a child. Since it was always just the two of us available for shifts consistently, for months, she would tell me daily about her marital problems, fights, resentments, and insignificant dramas. I remained neutral, even defended her husband every time. No flirting, no messages outside of work. I never shared my own problems. It was strictly one-sided, and no, not a single physical contact ever. Then, during one shift, I lost my temper and talked about my abusive girlfriend. That morning, when I was clearly stressed, Crystal asked, "What do you do to relieve stress?" I replied with a masturbate. As I walked away, it wasn't a good answer. Later that afternoon, she asked why I was still upset, and I vaguely vented. Her response was, "Why don't we have some fun tonight? You're stressed, and so am I with him." Wow, she was proposing an affair. I immediately rejected it, but later that night, she texted me a picture of herself in a see-through nightgown, asking if I was alone. I replied, "Are you crazy?" and ignored it. The next day, her husband found out. Turns out, she sent the photo as revenge. Because he had been texting his ex her excuse, he did it first. Now their marriage is shattered. Her husband is humiliated and barely speaks to me. Co-workers are talking about her, but some think I was too nice to her. Here's why I might be an asshole. I let her vent to me non-stop for months. Maybe I allowed an emotional intimacy that crossed boundaries. I vented about my ex once, which he unconsciously used to justify her proposition. Their marriage has never been the same, and I feel indirectly responsible. But I also think I never courted her, encouraged her, or crossed any lines. She chose to cheat, and I rejected her immediately. Was I just being a good listener even though I'm not? Or did I mess up by not stopping her earlier? From that moment on, the work environment became heavy. Crystal still worked in the same area, but we avoided each other as much as possible. The tension was felt in every corner of the place. People whispered when I passed by, though I could never quite make out what they were saying. I only noticed the furtive glances, the change in conversations when I approached. At first, I tried to act like nothing had happened, focusing on my responsibilities. But I knew the damage was done. Crystal, for her part, seemed to change attitudes constantly. Sometimes she would shoot me looks full of resentment, as if this were all my fault. Other times, she seemed regretful, even tried to talk to me a couple of times. But I had nothing to say to her. There was no turning back, and any attempt to discuss it would only fan the flames. The worst part was with her husband. Before all this, we used to work together without issues. He was a serious but respectful guy. Now, he could barely look at me. I tried to explain, to tell him that nothing had happened, that I never pursued her, that what she did was her own decision, but it didn't matter. From his perspective, I had been the catalyst for his misery. Even though he and Crystal already had problems before, I was the new element in the equation. For a while, I thought about quitting. I didn't want to stay in an environment where I was seen as the villain in a story I never wanted to be part of. But why should I pay the price for their mistakes? I had rejected Crystal. I had done nothing wrong. So I decided to stay and weather the storm. Months passed, and the scandal lost relevance. People found other topics to talk about, new gossip to keep them entertained. Crystal and her husband eventually separated. He left the job before she did. They say he moved to another city, far from all this. Crystal, on the other hand, stayed, but she wasn't the same. Her attitude completely changed. She became more reserved, less talkative. She no longer shared her dramas with anyone, or at least not in the same way. Maybe she learned her lesson, though too late. I moved on, trying to leave that episode in the past. But even though everything seemed to have calmed on the surface, I never completely got rid of that feeling of discomfort. Sometimes I wondered if I was really innocent in all of this. Maybe, without realizing it, I had been more receptive than I thought. Maybe I had contributed, even if minimally, to the illusion Crystal created in her head. I thought that was where the story ended. But I was wrong. One day, after an exhausting shift, I found a message on my phone. It was from an unknown number. "Do you still work at the same place? I'd like to talk to you." I had no idea who it could be, but I responded cautiously. "Who is this?" The reply came quickly. "I'm Crystal's husband." I felt a chill run down my spine. Why was he contacting me after so long? Did he want answers, revenge, an apology? I had no idea, but something told me that what was coming next wouldn't be good. Her husband's message left me unsettled. I didn't respond right away. My first instinct was to ignore it, pretend I had never seen it. But curiosity ate away at me. Why was he reaching out after all this time? Finally, I wrote back, "Yes, I still work here. What do you want to talk about?" A few minutes passed before his response came. "It's important. I need to clear some things up. Can we meet in person?" This all sounded like a bad idea, but I agreed. Not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted to put this matter to rest once and for all. We arranged to meet at a cafe near work. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting in a corner with a half-finished coffee. His expression was stern but not aggressive. I approached cautiously, feeling a pressure in my chest that I couldn't shake. I sat across from him without saying a word, waiting for him to speak first. "Don't worry, I'm not here to make a scene," he began. "I just want to understand what happened." I explained everything again, without embellishments or omissions. How Crystal confided in me about her marriage, how there was never anything more between us, how I had rejected her proposition immediately. He listened without interrupting, his face serious but without a trace of anger. When I finished, he sighed and ran a hand over his face. "You know, at first, I thought all of this was your fault, that somehow you had manipulated her or had been waiting for the chance to get between us. But after everything that's happened, I don't know what to think anymore." I felt a momentary relief, but his next words left me frozen. "A few weeks ago, I found messages from her with another guy. I don't know who he is, but the pattern is the same, saying she's unhappy, that she deserves something better, that she needs distraction. Exactly what they told me about you." I swallowed hard. The situation was escalating beyond what I had imagined. "And what do you plan to do?" I asked cautiously. He laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of humor. It was one of resignation. "Nothing. It's not my problem anymore. We signed the divorce papers last week. But I thought you should know, so you can stay alert." "Alert," I repeated, confused. "Crystal is obsessed with attention. If it's not you, it'll be someone else. But for some reason, you were her first choice. And I don't know if she's given up on that idea yet." The chill down my spine intensified. I hadn't had contact with her in months, but now the possibility of her reaching out to me again felt much more real. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. He finished his coffee and stood up. "Just be careful. I don't want another drama like last time. See you around." I watched him leave, and I sat there with the feeling that this wasn't over. The following days passed without incident. At work, Crystal kept her distance. Everything seemed to indicate that she was genuinely focused on moving on. However, I couldn't shake her ex-husband's warning from my mind. Had she really closed that chapter, or was she just waiting for the right moment to come back? Then, one night, I got a message. Not from an unknown number, but from Crystal. "I know you saw him. What he told you isn't true." The message alone didn't mean much, but the fact that she was reaching out after so long was unsettling. I ignored it, convinced that reopening that door wasn't worth it. But the next day, when I got to work, I noticed something different. I had avoided eye contact with her for months, but now I could feel her gaze on me, not one of hatred or shame, but of expectation, as if she was waiting for something from me. At the end of the shift, as I was leaving the building, I saw her waiting outside. "Can we talk?" she asked in a calm, almost pleading voice. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied firmly, walking past her. I wasn't going to make the same mistake again. But as I walked away, I heard her voice again, this time colder. "Don't believe everything they tell you." I turned around, unable to help myself. Her expression had changed. She was no longer the regretful woman trying to justify herself. There was something else in her eyes, something I couldn't interpret. For a moment, I wondered if I really knew her at all, if everything I had believed about her had just been a mask. But I didn't want to find out. I left without saying another word. That night, as I tried to sleep, one question kept running through my mind. Why now? Why, after all this time? Was she trying to get back into my life? And most importantly, what did that last sentence mean? The next day at work, someone left an envelope in my locker. No sender, just my name written in black ink. I opened it cautiously, feeling a knot in my stomach. Inside, there was a single sheet with a short message. "I knew you were going to reject me again, but this time I won't stay silent. My hands tensed as I read it. I didn't understand what she meant by that, but something told me it wasn't anything good. I looked around, trying to see if anyone was watching me, but everyone seemed occupied with their own things. I slipped the note into my pocket and closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm my mind. This was taking an unexpected turn, and something told me that the worst was yet to come. The envelope with the note was confirmation that Crystal wasn't done with all of this. I put it in my pocket and tried to focus on my work, but a lingering sense of unease stayed in my mind. Something inside me told me this was just the beginning of something much more complicated. Days passed, and although I didn't receive any more messages, the feeling of being watched never went away. Sometimes, while working, I noticed Crystal passing by too frequently. She never spoke to me, but her eyes followed my every move. It was as if she was waiting for the perfect moment to act. One night, as I was leaving work, I checked my phone and found a missed call from an unknown number. I didn't think much of it until I got home and saw I had a new voicemail. Hesitant, I played it. Do you think you're untouchable? This isn't over. You ignored me, but that doesn't mean I've given up. The voice was barely a whisper, but I recognized it instantly. Crystal. I sighed and placed my phone on the table. I wasn't going to play her game. I wouldn't respond. If she wanted a reaction, she'd have to try much harder. But as the days passed, her persistence became more evident. Anonymous notes started appearing in my locker. Small folded papers with vague but unsettling messages. You ruined everything. You shouldn't have rejected me. People forget, but I don't. I tried to ignore them. But each time I opened my locker and found another note, my discomfort grew. That's when I decided to talk to a supervisor. I didn't want this situation to escalate further. I explained the issue as discreetly as possible, without giving too many details, just mentioning that I had been receiving anonymous messages and was concerned someone was trying to bother me. The supervisor nodded and promised to look into it, though his expression showed he didn't take it too seriously. The following days, things seemed to calm down. No more notes, no more calls. I told myself that maybe Crystal had gotten the message, that she had realized she wouldn't get under my skin. But the peace was short-lived. One night, after work, I found my car with the tires deflated. They weren't slashed, just completely out of air. There were no cameras in the parking lot, so I had no proof of who had done it, but it didn't take a genius to figure it out. I ended up calling a tow truck and losing hours in the process. The next morning, I found another note in my locker. This time, more direct. I knew you'd listen to me sooner or later. Don't make this harder. Clenching my teeth, I crushed the paper in my hand. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was a veiled threat. But what unsettled me the most was the last sentence. What did "don't make this harder" mean? Harder for whom? For her? For me? I decided it was time to take more serious action. If the company wasn't going to do anything, I had to find another solution. But before I could plan my next move, something unexpected happened. Crystal stopped showing up to work. At first, I thought maybe she was sick or had taken a few days off. But when 2 weeks passed without any sign of her, I started to wonder what had happened. No one mentioned her absence, and when I asked some coworkers, I only got vague responses. I think she took a leave of absence. I heard she had personal issues. No one knew the truth. Then, one afternoon, when I checked my phone after work, I found another message from an unknown number. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a simple text. "You missed her, didn't you?" My stomach twisted. I didn't respond. But that night, as I tried to sleep, my phone vibrated again. Another message, this time just an image attached. It was a picture of me, taken somewhere near work. It looked like it was from that very morning. In the image, I was walking toward the building entrance. I wasn't alone. The impact of the image was immediate. My heart started pounding as my eyes scanned every detail of the photograph. It wasn't just the fact that someone was watching me, but the implication behind it. I wasn't alone. In the picture, a few meters away, there was a familiar silhouette. I couldn't make out the face, but I knew exactly who it was. Crystal. I tried to recall the moment the photo was taken. I had been so focused on maintaining my routine, on ignoring any possible sign of her presence, that I hadn't even noticed she was still around. The message contained no words, just the image, as if the mere evidence of her proximity was enough to convey what she wanted to tell me. But what exactly did it mean? A warning? A show of power? or just a reminder that she wasn't done with me. That night, insomnia took hold of me. Every shadow in my room seemed to stretch longer than it should. Every noise from the street put me on edge. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't let her have this kind of control over my life. I decided it was time to act. The next morning, before going to work, I went to the police station. I wasn't sure what I expected to accomplish, but I needed to leave a record, some trace of what was happening. The officer who attended me took my statement with visible indifference. He asked if I had proof that Crystal was harassing me. I showed him the messages, the image, explained the whole story. His response was a shrug and a phrase that sent chills down my spine. This doesn't prove she's doing anything illegal. Maybe she just wants to talk to you. My frustration grew, but I had no other options. The law didn't protect someone like me in this situation. I left the station feeling powerless, but more determined than ever. If the police weren't going to do anything, I had to protect myself in another way. That afternoon, I took a different route home. I avoided the main streets, turned unexpected corners, intentionally changed my routine. If Crystal was following me, I wanted to find out. I looked over my shoulder several times, but didn't see anyone suspicious. However, the feeling of being watched never left. When I got to my apartment, I checked every corner before feeling safe enough to relax. But then, my phone vibrated again. Another message. You thought you could hide, but I always know where you are. My fingers tightened around the device. This was no longer just harassment. It was a declaration of control. Crystal wanted me to know that she still had power over the situation, that no matter what I did, she would always be one step ahead. Despite my growing anxiety, I decided not to respond. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing she was getting to me. But inside, something had shifted. This was no longer just about staying away. It was about understanding how far she was willing to go. Days passed without any new signs of her. I started to think that maybe she had finally given up, that her last threat had been her way of closing the chapter. But the peace didn't last. One night, as I returned home, I found my apartment door slightly open. I froze in the doorway, adrenaline surging through my body. There were no signs of forced entry. The lock wasn't damaged. Someone had entered with ease. I stepped inside, cautiously, every muscle tense. Everything seemed to be in its place, but there was something different in the air, an unsettling sense of invasion that was impossible to ignore. I walked to the living room and saw it. On the table, there was a printed photograph, the same image that had been sent to my phone. But this time, it had something new. At the bottom of the photo, written in red ink, was a single word: smile. My body went rigid. This was no longer just harassment. This was something more, something I couldn't ignore. My mind filled with questions. How had she gotten in? How long had she been inside? Was she still nearby? My first instinct was to call the police, but I remembered their indifference last time. If they didn't take the messages seriously, what would they do now? I decided not to sleep in my apartment that night. I went to a friend's house, not giving too many details, just saying I needed a place to stay for a while. My mind kept analyzing the situation, searching for answers, trying to figure out how to take control. The next day, when I returned to my apartment, everything was intact, as if the night before had never happened. But I knew something had changed. This was no longer just paranoia, it was reality. Crystal was willing to cross any boundary. The question was, what was I going to do about it? After that night, I knew I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. Crystal had crossed a line she never should have, and now the threat was real. It wasn't just about messages or insinuations anymore. She had invaded my space, my life, and she had done it without me being able to stop her. That meant she wasn't afraid to keep going. I spent the next few hours evaluating every possible solution. If the police wouldn't do anything, if the supervisors at work wouldn't take it seriously, I would have to handle it myself. The first thing I did was change the locks on my apartment. I also installed a camera at the entrance, something discreet, but enough to capture any attempt at intrusion. I couldn't afford another night like the last one. Days passed, and surprisingly, there were no more notes, calls, or messages. The calm, while welcome, filled me with suspicion. Crystal wasn't someone who simply gave up. Her obsession was too strong to disappear overnight. So instead of feeling relief, I stayed on guard. The real sign that something else was brewing came in the most unexpected way. One afternoon, while I was working, a coworker approached me with a confused expression. "Did you know Crystal is back?" My muscles tensed immediately. "What?" "I saw her this morning in the building, talking to the manager. I'm not sure what she wants, but it looks like she's trying to get her job back." The air around me seemed to grow heavier. Why would she come back? After everything that had happened, after disappearing for weeks, what made her think she could just return as if nothing had happened? But there she was. At the end of my shift, I saw her in the workplace cafeteria, sitting with a cup in her hand as if she had never been absent. She made no attempt to approach me, didn't even pretend to be surprised to see me. Instead, she held my gaze with a smile that had nothing friendly about it. My first impulse was to confront her, demand answers, but I held back. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing that she affected me. In her twisted mind, any reaction from me was a victory. From that moment on, the tension at work became unbearable. Crystal had managed to get her job back and moved around with an unsettling sense of confidence. Although she didn't try to talk to me directly, I knew her presence was a provocation. She walked past me too often, making sure I noticed her. Sometimes I felt her gaze piercing my back. Other times I heard her laughing in the hallway, as if everything were just a game. But the worst part came when I started noticing that some coworkers treated me differently. Subtle glances of distrust, conversations stopping when I passed by, curt responses where there had once been camaraderie. I didn't understand what was happening until, one day, one of the women on my team approached me privately. "I heard something strange. I don't know if it's true, but I thought you should know." My skin prickled. "What did you hear?" She hesitated before answering. "Crystal has been saying that you harassed her, that you made her feel uncomfortable. I don't know the details, but people are starting to talk." My hands clenched into fists. So that was her plan. She couldn't break me with threats. So now she was trying to turn the story against me. "That's a lie," I said firmly. "Who else has heard this?" "A few people. She hasn't made a formal complaint, but she's been implying things. Enough to make some people doubt." I took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising fury inside me. I couldn't react impulsively because that would only play into her hands. I had to be smarter than her. The first thing I did was gather all the evidence I had. I saved the messages, the photos, anything that could prove what had really happened. Then, I decided to speak directly with the manager. If Crystal was making moves to smear my name, I had to get ahead of her. When I sat in the manager's office, I told him everything. I held nothing back. I showed him the evidence, explained her pattern of behavior, and how she was now trying to twist the story against me. The manager listened with a furrowed brow, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. "This is serious," he admitted, "but we can't make any decisions without solid proof." I gritted my teeth. "So what? You're just going to wait until she does something worse?" "What I'll do is talk to her and try to understand her side of the story. In the meantime, I suggest you keep your distance and continue gathering any relevant information." I left the office feeling like I had barely gained anything, but at least it was no longer a secret. If Crystal tried to take her accusations further, there would be a record of my side of the story. That same night, when I got home, I checked the recordings from the camera I had installed at my door. I didn't expect to find anything significant, but as I fast-forwarded through the footage, my blood ran cold. At 3 in the morning, a figure approached my door. It stood there, motionless, for several minutes. It didn't try to enter, didn't knock, just stood there as if making sure something was in place. Then, slowly, it slid something under the door and walked away. With trembling hands, I rushed to the entrance. There, on the floor, was a sealed envelope. I carefully opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. On it, written in delicate yet disturbing handwriting, was a short message. "If you don't want to play, then I'll have to change the rules." The game had escalated to another level, and now she controlled the story. The envelope on the floor was proof that Crystal hadn't just returned. She was willing to take her game all the way. Her message wasn't just a simple threat. It was a declaration of war. "If you don't want to play, then I'll have to change the rules." I read it over and over, trying to decipher what it meant. What rules? What else could she do that she hadn't already tried? I didn't dare sleep that night. I left the lights on, and every sound made me jump. At dawn, I decided I couldn't keep waiting to see what she would do next. I had to take the initiative. The first thing I did was take the camera recording to the police. This time, they couldn't ignore me. The evidence was clear. Crystal had been at my door at 3 in the morning, stalking me, leaving threats. It was enough to file a formal complaint. The officer who attended me couldn't remain indifferent to the recording. He took notes, asked for copies of the previous messages, and assured me they would investigate. However, what truly marked a turning point in the situation was a detail I hadn't noticed before. While reviewing the recording, one of the officers pointed at something on the screen. "Have you seen this?" I leaned in. In the corner of the video, reflected in the glass at the entrance, there was another movement. She wasn't alone. My skin prickled. Not only because someone else was involved, but because that detail changed everything. Crystal had never acted with someone else. It had always been a twisted game between her and me. Who was that person? And why were they there with her in the middle of the night? The officers took the recording as part of the investigation. They advised me to be careful, to call immediately if I saw anything suspicious. For the first time, I felt like they were taking me seriously. I decided not to go to work that day. I didn't want to give Crystal the chance to confront me directly. Instead, I checked into a hotel and spent the day analyzing everything that had happened. The situation had escalated to an unsustainable level. And the worst part was, I had no idea what would come next. At dusk, I received a call from an unknown number. I didn't answer. A few seconds later, a message came through. "I thought you'd be braver, Crystal." My blood boiled. There was no doubt she was taunting me. But what worried me most was what it implied. If she knew I wasn't at my apartment, that meant she was watching me. I decided I wasn't going to keep running. This time, I would face her. The next day, I returned to work as if nothing had happened. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me defeated. When I walked into the building, I noticed people whispering. Something had happened. It didn't take long to find out what. Crystal hadn't shown up to work. I felt uneasy. Her absence wasn't a sign that she had given up. It was the opposite. She was planning something. And I didn't have to wait long to find out what. Hours later, I received a call from the police. "We need you to come to the station. We have updates on your case." My heart pounded. I didn't ask questions. I went immediately. When I arrived, an officer greeted me with a serious expression. He led me into a room and showed me images captured by security cameras. I recognized the location instantly, the parking lot at work. In the footage, Crystal appeared alongside a man I didn't recognize. They were arguing. She looked agitated, gesturing frantically. Then, in an unexpected turn, the man shoved her forcefully. Crystal fell to the ground, hitting her head against the pavement. He looked around, hesitated for a second, then ran away. I sat in silence, trying to process what I was seeing. What happened next? I asked, my voice tense. The officer sighed. She was found unconscious hours later. She's in the hospital, in critical condition. She hasn't woken up yet. I leaned against the table, feeling everything I had built in my mind collapse. Who was the man in the video? We don't know yet, but we're investigating. I left the station without knowing how to feel. For months, Crystal had been my torment, a shadow I couldn't shake. Now, she was lying in a hospital bed, unable to hurt me. Should I feel relieved? Vindicated? I didn't know. All I felt was a strange emptiness, as if the story had ended in the most abrupt way possible. In the following days, the hospital confirmed that Crystal was still in a coma. The police identified the man in the video as an old acquaintance of hers, someone she had apparently had a complicated relationship with. He had nothing to do with me. Her obsession with me was just one part of her life, but there was more chaos in her world than I had imagined. Eventually, the police closed my case. I was no longer a target. I didn't have to worry about her anymore. Weeks later, I quit my job and moved to another city. I didn't want to stay in a place that still carried her shadows. I knew that, sooner or later, I had to leave all this behind. A month later, I received one last piece of news about Crystal. She had woken up, but she didn't remember anything that had happened in the past few years. It was as if everything that had transpired between us had been erased. I felt neither joy nor sorrow, just the certainty that, finally, I was free.